Okay, questions? You can, guys, you can go ahead and Google VARK if you want to look at the bark, and I'll be putting, that'll be a quiz, so I'll put that up over the weekend, and then it'll be due by next Friday. So it won't take you more than a few minutes. There we go. It's a little better. Okay, we're going to wrap up today with experimental design, and then we will finish today with some intro information about plants. Monday we will start growth, and then we'll go into cell walls, cell membranes, and organelles, and that may take us a couple of lectures. I'm not really sure yet. One thing you need to know that the slide sets or the PowerPoints that are up there, those are like core slides. And then I'll probably add some, and I'll either send those out to you or I'll put a notice up so that every year I try to add something new. So, but not much. Okay? So let's finish up talking about independent variables and dependent variables, and what have I left off of the slide? Which major thing did I leave off of that slide? The control, or the controls actually, usually. And the control is something that we don't mess with. So an independent variable, let's say we're looking at, and it's very common for some seeds, some species of seeds to require light to germinate. So, and not only light, but an actual specific wavelength of light. So we'd have seeds in the dark, which you could say would be the control. And then in our first experiment, we might have seeds in the dark, and then we would have seeds in light, just light. Fluorescent, incandescent, or some of the newer, what do you call the new ones? LEDs. You know, LEDs, there's a set of LED lights you can get. They're called Hue, H-U-E. And there are three of them, and plus a controller is about $150, $160. But you can get any color, period, out of those lights. Any wavelength that the lights, you can even get an app that that you can. This is the geekiest thing I've ever heard of. You can get an app for your phone that will tell you when they found another exoplanet, which, you know, that's a big thing now, is looking for planets and other suns. And when they find one, not only does it inform you on the app, but your hue lights then change to the color that that planet's light would be. That's pretty geeky. So anyway, that's a side, but anyway, and I do a lot of asides. You don't have to worry about learning that or anything. It's just, you know, it's pretty interesting information. So anyway, so we would have light would be what? That'd be the independent, and what would we measure? I'm sorry, the dependent, I'm sorry. And then we'd measure germination. So our what we would actually measure, our empirical data, would be the number of seeds that germinate, right? So in the light, in the dark, no seeds germinate. In the light, all the seeds germinate. And then we could take that a step. You know what I did? Okay, I did start sale. If I forget to start recording, could someone point that out to me? I'll do that every once in a while. Anyway, so then we'd measure germination. And then in the next experiment, we could take different colored filters from the rainbow and put that on top of the seeds, and then we could say, guess what? Red light causes them to germinate. And then we could take that red filter and we could change the hue of the red, and we just, and this literally is an experiment that was done a long time ago. It used to be a lot of seeds required light to germinate, or they had certain temperature requirements. If I want seeds that are like carrot seeds, or lettuce is the classic one, I have to order them. To do that experiment, I have to order them from a scientific supply house, because all commercial varieties have had those weird requirements bred out. So they don't really need light to germinate. Your commercial crop, you don't want something like light. So, but anyway, so you can see independent, dependent variable, and you could go on and on. Questions about that? Okay, there should be a study guide. Hopefully I'll put all the study guides up. They're all in Word format, so you can just add one to the next one. Some of the study guides are going to overlap. They'll have the same questions on them. I'm not going to go back and take some out. I just, sometimes I add on to the study guide, so just put them into one document. They should all be in Word, so you should be able to just add them into one file if you like. Okay. So now let's, this is the last intro, okay? So we got a little bit of an intro, then we do the experimental design, now we start with plants. And the only thing I want to cover today is some general information about plants. And then that'll end up the week. Everybody should be where they should be as of today. Everybody should be in the right room. And then we will get into the meat starting then Monday. So what do most seeds need? Here's just a picture of a dicot seed through the first few days of germination. And then you go from this seed on the left to a plant with true leaves on the right. So you have this little dry seed. And for the most part, most of the time, what's the only thing that seed needs to go from the left to the right side of the screen? Water. Water, period. Some of them require light, and of course for it to turn green on the right-hand panel would require light. But plants will grow appreciably in the dark, and in fact most plants grow a lot taller in the dark, right? It's called etiolation, and we'll cover that later. They're trying to grow up to the light. So you get these really tall white plants. But in general, only thing a seed needs, of course there's some seeds that require light, there's some seeds that require certain temperatures, but in general all you need to add is water. That's why we eat seeds. Seeds have everything they need to start. They've got stored starches, they have a lot of lipids in them, they have proteins, they have enough minerals to get started. So we just need to add water. And that's pretty phenomenal. You have an incredibly dry thing. No membranes are formed. There are bits of membranes around. You add water, and then with a few hours you can start measuring CO2 production because respiration has started. And you end up with this plantlet then in just a small amount of time. if we're looking at mineral nutrition deficiencies, just to give you an aside, there's some minerals, and you know that plants need nutrients. They need minerals. They need other things to live, of course. There's some minerals that they're called micronutrients that are needed in such small amounts. You may have to grow the plant 2, 3, or 4 generations without that single nutrient before you'd actually see deficiencies. Okay? We eat seeds because they're so rich in metabolites. And then we get this. We have this fully formed, and don't worry about the parts here. We have this fully formed plant, and we can look at the different parts, and we'll do this a little bit later. And this young plantlet has the ability to produce its own carbon. It's green, so it can fix CO2, and it has this incredibly important vascular system, so it can move material from out here in the soil into the plant and move it into this transport system and move minerals up to where they're needed, and at the same time it can take carbon and move the carbon around. Now, plants didn't start out the way we see them now, and there's we're not going to really go into the evolution of plants. Most of the plants that we see around here are pretty evolved, but anybody know what a ginkgo is? There's actually, I think there's a ginkgo on campus, I think over in front of the academic building. You know, that's a really, really ancient plant. Now, what is a plant? By the way, I love Wikipedia. And, you know, a lot of people say you can't use Wikipedia. Well, you know, in science you can. It may be not good in other areas, but we can look at what the definition of a plant is, and this goes on and on and on and on. And there are different kinds of plants. There are algae. There are vascular, non-vascular plants. So we have plants that do not have xylem and phloem. They do not have a vascular system. Some plants really don't have the ability to move. Most plants don't have the ability to move a lot. In the vascular plants, which is what we're going to talk about in here, of course, for the most part, we're talking about plants that are surrounded by a wooden box, or cells that are surrounded by a wooden box. And they are photosynthetic autotroph. What does that mean? What does autotrophic mean? Produces its own food. So plants produce all the carbon. They produce all the carbohydrates they need. They still need minerals. Plants like us can't survive without vitamins. Vascular means xylem and phloem. In plants like that we study here, in the centers there is tissue that moves water up to the top of the plant called the xylem, which we'll see Monday, and then phloem that takes material down the plant. Okay, and if we're talking about a tree, whatever size, most of that tree is what? What kind of transport tissue is this made from? Xylem. Got to move a lot of water in a tree. So we have a lot of xylem, and it's not all active, of course, but we move a lot of water in a tree. And of course, multicellular. Here's just an idea. Actually, when I was a student, I had a course called Ferns, Liverworts, and Mosses. So that was my plant ID course. And these are very, very simple plants. And then we look at this plant. We know more about this plant than any other plant in the world. It's Arabidopsis. It is the lab rat of the plant world. Okay, and the left one's a mutant, on the right's a normal Arabidopsis plant. Most people that do molecular biology and plant biology work on this thing, this weed. And we have several people here on campus. Dr. Kiowa in horticulture works on Arabidopsis. Why? It's a really small plant. You can grow it in your lab, and it produces a generation in about a month. So if you're doing any kind of important work, you've got to use genetics. You can develop mutants. You can order mutants of about anything you want. And then the data that's then found from working with the Arabidopsis then is used to see if it's compatible with other plants, which it usually is, you know. So the problems that a plant solves is food. Where does the food come from? Photosynthesis. What else does a plant need? The big plants, plants we're talking about in here, crop plants. What else does plants need? Huh? Light, absolutely. What else? Something I've mentioned several times already. Water. What else? CO2, yeah. CO2 to make the carbohydrate. Light, water. Nitrogen is a mineral. Needs minerals. Need nitrogen. Some plants can, of course, fix nitrogen, of course, but for the general part, plants need nitrogen. They need iron. Actually, you've heard of C. Hopkins. Everybody heard of that? That's the major elements for life. C. Hopkins, carbon, hydrogen, C. Hopkins. Actually, everything that's needed for life, it's C. Hopkins Cafe, managed by my cousin Mona Cliffsey-Cosi. That's every element that's needed for, not just for plants, but for anything that's living. So that includes both plants and animals. And the plant doesn't move much, so everything has to come to the plant. And here we go, just a list of what we've just talked about. And a normal plant has to move water up, which we're going to talk a lot about. Now let's talk a little bit about productivity. This is just a picture of the world, and the greener it is means that the net primary production is higher. So you can see basically where plants grow, where production, this is plant production. You know, where you would like to live and where you really wouldn't want to live. And we can actually look at something that's becoming fairly routine, is there are satellites that can measure chlorophyll. So here you see chlorophyll concentration, chlorophyll A concentration, and then the normalized difference vegetation index, which are the darker the green, the more the more vegetation, and then where do we find most chlorophyll? Where's most blue? The
Amazon basin.
Yeah, it's actually, if you look through the green and the blue being the highest concentration of chlorophyll, and then right across you see where we have a lot of light. And here's blue. And then where we have water on the land part, okay? Now, the next three curves are about climate change. The fourth slide I'll show you is something we're going to spend some time looking at. It's a system that people are using. The big thing that people are doing now, of course, is seeing what climate change is going to do to plant production. And There's several ways you can look at this. If you look at the differences in the temperatures, and what you can see as you move over to the right, that these things really fluctuate up and down. And that if you look at the marks for warmest decade, we're right here where we are now. And the coldest was a bit ago, not long ago. There's another way where it's looking at where this is temperature anomalies. And so we have what's called the Little Ice Age that happened around the 1700s. And then we're up to here, and you can see where we are is we're really, really up here. So we're up to where it was in the warming period back here. Something that we can measure is that we're coming up with a tremendous amount of CO2. In fact, the CO2 level is way up here now. So first thought is, okay, we got higher CO2, so plants could fix more carbon. Remember last time I told you that for most plants, for over 90% of plants, oxygen keeps carbon fixation low or lower. So right off the bat we can say, well, if we grow plants in a greenhouse supplemented with CO2, which you can do, not in Texas, why can't you do that in Texas in the summer? Too hot. But there are places where they add CO2 to greenhouses. Plants grow higher. Plants increase their mass more. So is there a problem with high CO2s? We'll get into that later in the semester, but doing experiments in the greenhouse, doing experiments in a growth chamber are fine, but how do you look at the effects of these things in the real world? Okay. In fact, some people that work on plants in growth chambers even wear respirators so that the CO2 they give off doesn't enter into the system. Okay? So we're going to talk a lecture or so about this system. This is in Illinois. And what is incredible about this system, if you see this line around it, or this polygon around it, is that because of the technology we have available now, that green outline is CO2 emitters. And using computer controls, they can increase the level of CO2 in the field inside that polygon. If the wind blows, they know how fast the wind blows, so the CO2 then would be going up, the levels will be increased on the emitters up of the wind stream, so they can literally, within reason of course, keep the concentration of CO2 high inside that green polygon in the field, in the real world. So now you don't have to worry about, the constant temperature in a growth room. You can actually see what high CO2 levels do to crops in the real world. Okay? And there's some for temperatures. There's a system in Arizona, I think, where they actually have some kind of blast furnaces that can actually raise the temperature inside a zone similar to this in the field. Now, we find plants almost everywhere, and plant form is very plastic. What do I mean by plastic? Diverse. In a same plant grown at a different location may be different. So if you take a plant, and this is a generality, if you take a plant that's normally grown, let's say, where there's a lot of sun, you put it where there's not a lot of sun, the leaves may actually get bigger, to try to capture more sunlight. Some plants do, some plants don't. Plants have ability to respond to their environment, Because they don't move very much. Here's some particular kinds of plants. Where do you find these plants? You know, you look at, where are these plants? Yeah, where there's no water. So why do the plant? Look at the leaves on these plants. Do you see leaves on these plants? Not really. Leaves are where plants lose water, right? Something you hear over and over again. This is conundrum. The only way that a plant can get water up into the leaves is for that water to exit the leaf through the atmosphere. So that's crazy. That the evolution has been the only way for the water to get in up the plant, which, by the way, takes the minerals up, is that the water's got to leave. So you get this continuous loss of water. You can't continuously lose water in the desert. So the plants that you find in deserts have evolved to handle that environment. They have a particular kind of photosynthesis, which we'll talk about. And they do well. Do they grow a lot? Not very fast, no. You know, these plants, you know, you wouldn't want to feed a lot of people on cacti because they don't grow fast enough. There are other plants in the desert that when they get the occasional rain, they germinate and flower and are gone within a few days. And they reproduce, boom, gone, just in a few days. When that occasional rain comes. Yes, sir.
I went to the Desert Botanical Garden in Arizona.
Uh-huh.
In Phoenix or wherever, Glendale, wherever the heck it is. And one of the guys said that they were having such problems with people moving to Arizona, and they wanted, you know, the big saguaro cactuses, but they were watering their front yards because they also wanted the green grass.
Yeah.
So they were watering their yards 2-3 times a day, which was basically triple or quadruple the normal rainfall that they would get. And so you have these huge saguaro cactuses that would like fall through people's like roofs and onto their cars and just smash them because they're not used to that kind of
Yeah, yeah. If they get too much water, they're not happy either.
Yeah.
You know, yeah. They want green, so they want green grass and cacti at the same time. That ain't going to work. You know, I always wonder why people want green grass, of course, because that means I'd have to cut my grass, so I don't want that. Here's a weird little plant. You've heard of C3 photosynthesis, and you've probably heard of C4 photosynthesis, right? This plant does both. Has the ability to do both. So that's how plastic it can be. It can change between C3 and C4. So this is portulaca. And it's a pretty remarkable little plant. You know, it fills another niche. What can I say? Here's a plant called rice, and this plant normally grows flooded. And this plant can handle flooding just fine. And doesn't have a problem with it. If you did this to most plants, if you flood, by the way, every time you water a plant, you are flooding it. And most plants can withstand a good bit of flooding. A few days. They're not going to grow. The respiration is cut down to almost zero. And don't worry, you'll learn all about that. But they can outlast the flooding. They shut down and wait. And unless you get a continuous amount of flooding, the plants are fine. In this next picture, this is what happens when you get way too much water for way too long. And this is a field in Iowa in 1992, which probably none of you remember, but there was a massive flood in the Midwest, the worst flood in hundreds of years. The entire Midwest was blue. And it flooded basically all the way down the Mississippi. Incredible amount of loss. So this is what happens when you have a crop that has too much water. It dies. Right? Can't handle it. That right panel is something that my colleague and I, he was actually the expert on. You see a cross-section of a root, and you see these huge holes in the root. So when you flood a plant for a day or so, nothing happens. You flood it for a little bit longer, and that plant root actually opens holes, pipes, all the way down the root. What's the purpose of those open pipes? Pull some oxygen down. They're called parenchyma. So the first thing a plant does is nothing, and I'm talking about, say, corn. This is corn. We only worked on corn. Then it says, okay, I'm flooding too long, so let me actually sacrifice some of my root tissue to form a pipe so that some oxygen can diffuse down from above the flooding period down and keep the root alive. Not much going on there. The plant runs out of energy if the flooding keeps on and it's dead and it falls over. So we saw fields we saw fields that were absolutely totally black. Just all the corn had completely decayed. And then you see this. Oh, sorry, too fast. Then you see this. This is in Louisiana, where these trees grow in swamps, and the base of the plants bow out a lot because they've developed structures to move oxygen down into the roots. And that's where they live. You know what I'm talking about when you go see a plant that's normally a tree, not a plant, a tree in a swamp. You see that big bow out right above the water level? That's excess holes for oxygen to get down into the roots. You still got to hold the tree up. The tree's still got to be held up by roots. So they've adapted to that environment over time. If you flood most trees, they're not going to do that. And then if we go to the other extreme, these are these really tall trees, the tallest trees. And we've got to get minerals and water all the way up to the top, which is hard. And when we talk about water potential, we'll be talking about the movement, the physics of water movement. And how can you get water 200 or 300 feet up? That's really hard to do. There's not a vacuum pump that can do that. Okay? Questions? Okay, you guys are getting out early today. I'm going to start this on Monday. So more or less the course will start in terms of most of the content on Monday. Any questions? I've got a discussion list or a discussion question on there. If you have any questions, I see that several of you have added me on the Google Hangouts. That's good. I'll put some more stuff up about that this weekend. Okay? See ya. Have a good weekend.